Okay. Our topic is, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be asking our speakers about their preferred prayer disciplines. But, I guess that's a little boomy. Before we do anything, if you guys haven't all figured this out yet, this wonderful conference really wouldn't be happening if it weren't for Bishop Herzog. Mm-hmm. And this is so. And he's been hard at work on this project for a long time and completely energized by it, and we're all beneficiaries of that. And so, Bishop Dan, thank you so much. Amen. As Bishop Dan suggested earlier, this is really where the tire hits the road when we move out of the classroom into the presence of Jesus, and this stuff it takes on a kind of reality to it. And so I'm probably not going to say much else because I suspect that once we get going, they're going to talk, and that's fitting. So I'm just going to. I do have some things I want answered, and I'm just going to give you a shotgun of themes that you can pick up as you like. And if the sort of flow of conversation dies down, I'll try to reignite it. But I suspect that won't happen. But so we're curious about your prayers of discipline, what works for you, what comes out of the things you've been telling us. And so I have a number of just sort of things you just might want to touch on and see if any of these things are part of your own personal ascesis, your own prayer life. I'm curious to know whether each of you, whether you follow some version of the daily office, the divine office, liturgy of the hours, and how that works for you. Something I've found really helpful, and a lot of people I know find helpful, is the Jesus prayer. And obviously, this is Father Chad. This is something you will be able to speak about, I'm sure, very personally and authoritatively. I wonder whether others use that, and also I'm sort of curious as to whether, without getting too sort of intellectual and academic about it, I'm curious to know whether Father Chad feels that the Jesus prayer has a sort of coherence and authenticity outside of strictly sort of the ecclesial life of the Orthodox Church, and it's developed quite a popularity outside of the Orthodox world, and I'm curious to know how you react to that. But more seriously, whether this sort of thing is part of your prayer life. Other forms of meditative prayer, whether they be Ignatian, or sort of centering prayer, or Lectio Divina, or something more sort of your own sort of instinctive approach. Intercessory prayer, do you keep lists? How do you manage your lists? How do you manage the tension between your own utterance to God and the role of silence in your personal prayer life? Extemporaneous prayer, or do you find you're using prayers that you've prayed over and over? Do you use memorized prayers? What role do the Psalms play in your prayers? Do you attend daily services simply for your own edification, quite apart from something you have to do? And finally, a more general question. The Bishop Scharfenberger mentioned the theme of time. When I talk about prayer in the parish, it always strikes me, because actually this is a theme in my own life, that the most important thing, it seems to me, about prayer is that we actually give it the time. And what we do is less important than the time we put into it, because God uses that time. So how do you manage the problem of time? But also, in relation to the other questions, how do you use that time? So that's a whole sort of shotgun shell version of a collection of questions that you guys can run with. Whoever wishes to speak, go for it.
Well, I think Father Chad approached first.
Okay. I concur.
Yeah.
You're outvoted, Father Chad.
There it is. Yeah. Well, Your Grace, you're wearing the purple cassock, so I'm outranked. Actually, I was contemplating your question about the Jesus prayer outside of the Orthodox tradition. And there would be some Orthodox who would answer you in a very negative way. And they would say that it takes one into a place of depth where without proper spiritual guidance, it would actually be quite dangerous. I wouldn't, personally, I wouldn't say that because I put it in the same category as I do icons. Icons are particular to the East, and yes, we have a particular way in which we reverence them. There's a particular way in which we produce them. There's a particular way in which we venerate them. They're prominent in our homes. Most Orthodox homes would have what you would call a prayer corner. And that's a place that's sanctified within the house. I've been in households where there have been very sort of hyper children, and I watched them running through the house, and they stop, pause, make the sign of the cross as they go past the prayer corner, and then pick up again. So that just simply means that they have learned that there is such thing as sanctified space.
Right.
But to underscore that, I would say, again, in our tradition, it's important to have another set of eyes. And unfortunately, as Americans, we like Lone Rangerism. We like to, it's just me and Jesus. We got our thing going on, And in this tradition, I know spiritual direction is important. But to have that kind of spiritual direction, spiritual oversight, a certain sense of accountability, is so essential to guard one particularly against pride. Because you take off on your own, and we have an inclination to become Gnostic anyway. And so we have all this secret knowledge, and it leads to something that's really devastating to the soul. I'm very cautious about people that do things like put up a sign, outside their office, spiritual father available, or something like that. I teach my students, when you see things like that, run as fast as you can. In our tradition, we have a saying that Metropolitan Kallistos Ware repeats a lot, which is to call no man holy until he's drawn his last breath, because there's always the opportunity to apostatize. But we do something regarding the Jesus prayer at St. Vladimir Seminary that has evolved out of the experience of the monastery of St. John the Baptist in Essex, England. And so on Friday mornings as a community, and this is important for us because we have Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian students, so that's the one time we can gather in the chapel. We all pray Lectio Divina in very much the fashion of Essex. And so we corporately pray the Jesus prayer, have the reading of Scripture, silence, meditation. And when you have a busy, hectic, intense kind of life like anyone does in a theological seminary, that's a remarkable thing. But it has reminded me the importance of silence, and I will say this as a personal kind of confession. The older I get, the more I crave silence. And I really do. It's something that I find I get agitated about if I don't carve out that kind of silence. I guess the final thing I would say on that is this, in terms of spiritual direction and silence. Sometimes we get these overzealous people, it's like, oh, come on, Father, give me a rule of prayer, and you give them one, and it's like, that's just, nothing. Anybody can do that. Well, start with the nothing, because there's nothing worse than to take on a prayer rule that is something you cannot sustain, and then you feel badly, and you feel guilty, and you end up sort of burning out altogether. So even when it comes to silence, I will often say to my own confessees, penitents, spiritual children, try 5 minutes of silence, just being present to the Lord a day. 5 minutes. Oh, that's a piece of cake. You see, they'll always say that. It's not. It's not. And when you've mastered that, then you come back and we can talk about deeper things. But I guess that's where I put the full stop for now on that one.
Okay, I'll say a few words. I think we would want to say, though, to you, there isn't one pattern of prayer that will work for everybody.
Yeah.
And because if we give that impression, it would make the whole life of prayer a work and doesn't flow from grace. So we've got to find our own way. Now, my wife and I, we met when we were teenagers. We met in the same church, and our evangelical vicar educated us to bear in mind that if we walk with God, every moment is prayer. And so he taught us actually the importance of arrow prayers, walking along the street to pray, but most importantly, the importance of a quiet time. That's a very evangelical thing to do, a quiet time. What he meant by that? Take time to focus on the scriptures. And that is our approach. I meant to bring along this afternoon, in fact, I've lost it, so here's an appeal. If anyone sees an iPhone 6 around with a cover, and it's blue, it's mine. So I'm lost without it, but I don't know where it is. It could be in this room, it could be back in the vestry. Don't panic! I'm panicking. Because on it, I've got my prayer discipline, and it's called Murray McCheyne, a Scottish divine, and it's a way of reading the scriptures, and I love it. I've got it in Hebrew and Greek, and so it keeps the Bible languages going for me, and I find I read it and I can pray through the readings of the Bible. And what you have to do is to read 4 chapters a day, and that's pretty heavy going, you know. I'm at the moment on 2 chapters a day, and the other one is we're working through the Psalms, and that, for me, that is wonderful. And so I would urge you, pray the Bible, pray scriptures, take a verse into the day and let it be your guide. I find that so compelling. So coming from an evangelical tradition, I say this for myself, but I think I speak for Eileen as well. We have broadened out considerably. It's interesting you talked about Wesley, and thank you for a fine address. I really did appreciate that. That was perfection. As well as Father Chad's, both were gripping material. You talked about him being an evangelical Catholic. I think I'm a Catholic evangelical.
There you go.
In that I haven't lost my identity and the sharpness, the focus, but I've broadened out quite considerably. And so I can do these Catholic things quite comfortably because there's meaning in them and behind them. And so I love it. And part of our problem in terms of Eileen and myself, when I was in office, we prayed every day in the chapel, wonderful place where the Reformation started. And it was so moving to pray there. We are on the go. We're mavericks now, aren't we, Eileen? We are traveling the world, and so we have to fit in to the local diet. And I want to actually commend our beautiful and wonderful sisters here. They are absolutely fantastic. Over there, you've got one of the best kept secrets of the Anglican Communion. And you ought to be really proud of it in this diocese, and you ought to nurture it and encourage people to take as much advantage of it as I can. I'm looking at Mother Miriam because she may be saying, I don't want too many bodies there, you know. We have enough problems as it is. But they're such welcoming people, but it's a terrific thing. So, in short, prayer is important. Walking with one another, sharing deeply, praying at the beginning of the day for our family and other needs as well, slotting into wherever we are, and reading the scriptures and going deeper into them and thanking God for his mercy. Over to you, my brother.
Well, you know, I can't tell you how awkward I feel sitting here in this spot. I feel like I'm a stumbler and a struggler and a learner in this thing of prayer. I do try. I don't think I succeed very often. I have a rhythm, and the rhythm includes several things, and maybe it shows how OCD I really am, but the rhythm includes the Book of Common Prayer. It includes Northumbria community materials. It includes the Universalis website and the Liturgy of the Hours. And, I'll go seasons. I'll be 4 weeks in one and I'll go somewhere else, or I'll do morning prayer in one and evening prayer or compline in another. So I bounce around a bit. But I find those things very, very formative for me. I too am an evangelical and come from that tradition, and so the daily quiet time has been just drilled into my being, so that I guess the difference for me is that I need to get away from being an academic, because academics have a hard time listening to the Spirit, because I'm always trying to make the Bible into a textbook so that I can learn something and therefore teach it, but rather I need to listen for the voice of the Spirit. So there's what I pray to do is cultivate a spirit of attentiveness to what the Spirit might be saying. And so in that daily quiet time in Scripture, my hope and goal, my aspiration is to read long or short until I know that something has spoken to me. And then I record that in a reflection and use that to meditate on. And that's really essentially the kind of the daily pattern of my life, which is a little bit bumpy, as I've confessed, but it's workable for me right now.
I was saying to Nashota House students last week the importance of taking their mind into their spirituality, and taking their spirituality into their mind. So you must resist the distance between critical theology and your prayer life. And if you do separate in that kind of, you're in trouble.
Right.
So what you said then is so important, is actually when you're reading the Bible, it's quite proper to have said, well, what's going on here in the story? I'd like to know more about it. In the same way, when you're reading Balthazar or John Calvin or whatever, you're actually saying, I don't quite agree with that. What he's saying doesn't seem to ring true to the Bible or to my Catholic experience or Orthodox experience or whatever. So it is important to bring them together, isn't it?
Yeah, thank you.
I think when you use the word rhythm, I immediately perked up, because I know that in my own prayer life, I'm saved by rhythm and routine. I know from whence I was formed spiritually, and without a doubt, it's in that Benedictine-style rhythm. And as Anglicans, you know the great treasure you have in the daily office. It's simple, it's structured, and it gives you the pattern for the reading of Scripture, and it's easily incorporated into a daily routine. I'm blessed to live in a community where we have matins and vespers every day, and liturgy gets tossed in here and there as well, and that's great. And I certainly understand and appreciate the importance of corporate worship. But my youngest son once said something after meeting a member of the clergy when he was 10 or 11 years old. When he left, my son said to me, "Well, Dad, that's what I call a paid professional holy man." And at first I chastised Sean for being rude, but Sean's now a lawyer, so he learned early to defend himself. So he quickly said, no, he said, I get exposed to a lot of clergy, and he said, some of them, he said, reflect a certain kind of holiness that I recognize, well, that's a priest. But he said, some of them have all the external, but there's no heart.
Yeah.
And that's a danger. So I actually used that quote from Sean, even with seminarians, about the danger of becoming what he referred to as a paid professional holy man. So rhythm is very important in your personal prayer life, and if you break the rhythm, it's very difficult to get that back.
We have a question. Sure. Okay. I'd like to ask Father Chet if he could give us a 4 or 5 minute seminar on 5 minutes of silence. I try to be silent. The first thing I think is, oh, I didn't pay my cell phone bill. I think I left the light on in my office and all the things I've got to do. It's very hard to, how do you go about it?
I'm thinking about the phone bill too, but all of us struggle, and that was why I was underscoring the importance of it. It takes a real discipline to learn to simply be present to the Lord. And you know, those of us that, as I said, are blessed to live within a very structured community often know that our mind is not there in the chapel, and so we're actually carried by our community. They're praying when we aren't. So I also recognize that as a Christian, I'm part of a faith community that is carrying me when I am weak. But the idea of, especially in my tradition, is just being quiet in a prayer corner. But I will also say this, I have found gardening as a very important niche for me. It's something that allows me to get completely away from that kind of academic environment you were talking about. And I find probably I can be quiet and reflective upon the Lord doing that kind of work. And again, it's very Benedictine. It's the Opus Dei, you know, the kind of hand. And those of you that know the great classic book, The Way of the Pilgrim, you know that eventually you can attain that kind of rhythm in your life where you are in a constant state of prayer and knowledge that you are in the presence of God. And sometimes I would also say just this, those distractions may be your guardian angel speaking to you. So, you know, be alert, because we live in such a noisy culture and environment. I mean, people mow the lawn with things on their ears and whatever else. We can't hear the Lord. When I was a priest serving in Africa in the early 1980s, I remember very, very clearly serving in a bush setting, which they rarely saw a priest. And people would walk 4 or 5 days, you know, to get to liturgy. And a man very excitedly told me that, you know, Father, as we were coming here, the Archangel Gabriel appeared to us and said, a clinic should be built here. Well, you know, in a Western environment, you'd get out your Rolodex in those days and look for the nearest referral, because this man's obviously lost his mind. But if you know and appreciate and love African Christianity, it's such a quiet world. He could hear the Archangel Gabriel say, a clinic should be built in this place. And indeed, there was follow-up and a clinic was built. But we just don't have that kind of quiet to allow it. So keep struggling with it, and eventually it will come.
Could I add to that, really? Because one person's wandering thoughts can be another person's whisper of the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
In other words, I've tried to do this over the years, that if I've got those wandering thoughts, instead of brushing them aside, bring them in. Bring them into your prayer life and encourage them to come closer. So you incorporate the business of life in that, because we are interrupted by, you know, doubts and fears and worries. And in the case if we've got questions about our grandchildren, these are perfectly ordinary human worries. You bring them and wrap them up in your prayers. The other thing I meant to say earlier, I learnt long ago the importance of thanksgiving. And thanksgiving at the beginning of the day is something I invariably do. Don't always do it, because I want to confess also that I wander from the pathway, you know, because sometimes the world does clash with your spiritual journey and you forget things. But invariably, I start the day with thanksgiving. Why do I do that? Because it puts into relief actually what life is all about. If you start thanking God for, first of all, you had a good night's sleep. If you didn't, you thank God for sleep. You thank Him that you're here facing another day. You thank Him for your family life and all these rich things. Then you start to pray for what you're going to do. And then you suddenly find that against all the worries of life, all the thanksgiving dwarfs all that is to come. I find that so liberating indeed. I once talked to a film producer, and I asked him about how they create all those terrible animals, on the great, whatever, Planet of the Apes and all this kind of thing, which I don't watch. How do you do it? He said it's quite easy. We destroy the background and we replace a background by cartoons and figures that dwarf us. And if we have the backdrop of Thanksgiving removed, then all kind of fears and phantoms come into our mind. And for me, that's been a very good analogy.
I find actually with Thanksgiving that once you get going with it, there's always more to be thankful about. And what happens is it radically increases your confidence in the God you're praying to.
Yeah.
So you pray with a kind of new quality of assurance.
Yes, I fully agree with that, really. I really do. And the thing about prayer and answered prayer, someone asked, or you asked the question, do you keep lists? I used to keep lists, and what I found actually with lists, how often your prayers were answered. And I regret that I don't keep a list these days, because you suddenly find yourself being surprised by things that have happened, you prayed for, they're being answered, and you've taken it for granted, and then we find ourselves doubting that God answers prayer. And, I think we ought to be a little more professional about this in our church life, and to thank God more for those answered prayers than we do at the moment.
Sort of related to some of this conversation in terms of Thanksgiving and gratitude, I think it's Father Lynn's book, Sleeping with Bread. You know that little book, children's book, which basically introduces this simple practice of the daily examen of usually at the end of the day rather than the beginning, but at the end of the day, looking back over the last 24 hours and touching base with those things for which I'm grateful. And to do that, there's always something, even though you don't always notice it until you stop to take a moment to notice it. And gratitude is always an expansive emotion. It's an expansive response. And when I sense myself being grateful for things, it always sooner or later moves to the giver, who's ultimately the giver of all good gifts. And so gratitude becomes this very freeing and opening thing in a relationship with God, I think. For me, it does.
I have another question for you all. I'll preface it by saying that there are thousands of books about prayer, thousands of people you can go to for guidance. And I would say for myself, and this is kind of in response to Dan's question, because it deals specifically with the issue, for me the most useful, if I had to pick one book that's been helpful for me with prayer, actually it's really a pair of books, but the Courage to Pray and Beginning to Pray. It's very pedestrian titles, really, by Archbishop Anthony Blue, who's an Orthodox bishop in, I guess, England. But those books are so authentic. No sort of spiritual cant, and he deals with silence. He does talk about the Jesus prayer. He talks about a lot of things, and I've just found them to be psychologically, theologically, and spiritually insightful and basic good sense. Now, that's my plug. What about you, gentlemen? Do you have something?
Well, can I take over from that? Because Eileen and I knew Anthony Bloom very well.
Oh.
We used to have tea with him, didn't we? And he was a special friend to Eileen. And he was such a wonderful man. He was so greatly admired in Britain. As you know, he was a doctor, converted, became Orthodox, lived in Paris, came to London. We worshipped with him. His voice was powerful on the radio. He was someone we looked up to and gained so much from in terms of his prayer life, discipline. And I would echo what you said. His books are really well worth reading. A book I would also commend, because you, Doug, mentioned the prayers of the New Testament, and that's the title of a book by Donald Coggan.
Oh, yes.
Yes, who wrote a lovely book on...
Your predecessor.
Yeah, but one.
Wow, that's good. A couple things come to mind for me, not necessarily major books, but an article that I read years ago, and I do not know the author of it. I wish I did. I need to find it. Somebody can Google it for me. The title was something like this, on learning to be a contemplative in the midst of chaos. And that little article has stayed with me for probably 20 years, maybe 30 years now, because I come from an activist tradition, and we don't do contemplation well.
No.
But we do busyness well.
Yeah.
And so when that little article just spoke to me in such a way that, if I can live this busy life and realize that there's a fundamental affirmation that God is always active. And if I can develop the attentiveness that it takes to sense what it is that God might be doing, being, about in anything, that's a huge thing, to be able to notice that. How do I become a contemplative in the midst of the chaos of life? And maybe it's this inner yearning to want to become part of a monastery or something, and Eugene Peterson writes about living as though you lived in a monastery without walls. Somewhere, I don't know where he says that, but he talks about this. And the praying of the Psalms, for example, I can never fit the whole 150 in 1 week, but I do actually take my Bible, whatever version I happen to be using at that time. I go through like seasons on that too. And so I divide it up into, I just divide the number of pages in the Psalter in my Bible in 30, and I have enough to read a day, about the same amount. And the praying of the Psalms takes away I used to do lists as well. And the problem with the list, it seemed like a grocery list. It was all about me and my stuff, and those are really good and important. But when I started praying the Psalms regularly, all of a sudden the Spirit would put particular names in the Psalter. My mind was praying those words of the Psalms, and yet it turned out to be about my father, or about my children, or about the needs of the world, or Syria, or some, and all of a sudden it was immediately relevant, and yet it was the ancient words of the Hebrew prayer book. So those have helped me a lot.
Yeah.
One of the things that is expected of a first-year seminarian at St. Vladimir's is that they must write the Psalter out by hand.
Oh.
And the reason for that is we've discovered our students don't read anymore. And it becomes a way in which they can sort of integrate the Psalter into their own being. We may run up to some problem there because we find less and less students who can write in cursive because they haven't been taught. So printing out is going to be an interesting exercise for them, but that's a sort of echo of what you had to say. And another echo for what His Grace had to say is about Thanksgiving. Probably Schmemann's book on the Eucharist had as much an impact on my corporate prayer life as any book. That saying, if we are truly the people of joy, why do we look so glum? And the answer is because we don't start our day with Thanksgiving, as His Grace said, and we're Eucharistic Christians, all of us who are gathered here, and so our entire being every day should be in preparation for that next call to the great banquet table. And then, of course, I am shameless. We have a book stall here, but there is a very new, thin, easy-to-read book by Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeev on prayer. It's not expensive. It's based on a television program that he has on Sunday afternoons in Moscow. So it deals with all the different aspects of prayer. Interesting enough, his program in Moscow that had the highest ratings was the one in which he was addressing road rage. And again, that's just simply an example of of a member of the clergy addressing a contemporary issue that is obviously explosive for people.
Right.
I wonder if I could ask a question of Father Chad in terms of icon.
Yes.
And praying before an icon. And we are recent discoverers in terms of the beauty of icons, and our house is now full of icons. And we've been given some by the Patriarch of Moscow and His All Holiness, the Ecumenical Patriarch, and they're very precious to us. Could you give us some guidance about icon and, veneration of icons and what you do with them?
Yeah. Well, I do wish my wife were here now because she's actually a trained iconographer. And she speaks beautifully about the process of creating an icon, which must be done with prayer and fasting.
Excuse me.
Not the reproduced ones that you see, but the actual ones. But it's like the creation of man, in that the process on the board that's covered in gesso, you start with the process and eventually the face comes forward, and it really is like a face coming up out of the earth. So the creation of an icon is very much parallel with God's creation of you and me. In fact, in the Orthodox tradition, when we sense the icons in the church, we also sense the people, because we are the perfect icon, having been created in the image and likeness of God. We know about the councils and the definition of terms, so we aren't worshiping icons. But what it is that we venerate? Well, what we venerate is, in fact, the light of Christ that is seen in that image. And that's why you don't see emotion in icons. When my wife was at university, she was an art history major, and she was told, oh, those things are because they hadn't learned perspective yet. Well, in fact, that's not correct at all. They're intentionally passionless, so to speak. And whether that's the saints, or the Theotokos, the Virgin Mary, or icons of Christ. Some of the most incredible, like stained glass windows in the West, some of the most incredible iconography I've seen have been created in domes that give the life of Christ in Scripture. And in illiterate cultures, that was a way of teaching the life of Christ. But I think when you recognize the Orthodox tradition that when the icon is present, so is the saint. When Christ's icon is present, so is Christ. That helps one to get focused. I don't know, some of my sisters who are here might have some other things to add to that, but well, I won't try to sell another book, but anyway, there are some that help to explain that a little bit better. I will say one quick story, just because it makes it memorable. I mentioned prayer corners. I served in Alaska for 5 years. Actually, when my wife and I, we were actually expelled from South Africa. They withdrew my residency permit in the bad old days. So I went back to graduate school. What else would you do, right? But seriously, my wife and I used to pray that we would be sent back to Africa because we felt that the seminary was the place where you actually really laid the groundwork for the future of the church. Well, the Lord heard our prayer. He sent us to Alaska. And the only thing that Africa and Alaska have in common is that they both begin and end with the letter A. But we were totally blessed to have a time at an Alaskan seminary. But one of the things that I discovered about Alaskan culture is they don't do Christmas trees. But I often wondered when I lived here in the lower 48, who bought all that stuff at Walmart and Target and other such things? Flashing lights and tinsel and stuff. Well, I can tell you, it's the Alaskans. That's how they decorate their prayer corners at Christmas. They don't do trees, but they do the prayer corners. And you see these remarkable flashing lights and tinsels and other such things. But again, it becomes a way in which the children are taught about the incarnation, its importance, and that this is sanctified space of the home. It's really quite nice.
Bishop Dan, how are we doing on time? Technically, it looks like we were supposed to stop at 4:45, which is well behind us.
We maybe have 2 more minutes left. I have a question. Can you help on the role of spiritual direction and reconciliation in your lives?
Yes, I have a spiritual father who said to me not long ago that my sins are so grave that I cause my guardian angel to blush. So that's enough said about me.
I haven't got a spiritual director. I do not have a spiritual director, and I regret that I haven't.
I have 3 spiritual friends, and unfortunately, none of them are formally spiritual directors, but they're the kinds of people that I can be, not that I can be, that I am demanded to be completely honest with, and they speak back into me on a regular basis. And they're actually right now from different directions. I assume the Spirit, because they're sort of waiting for me in a discernment process to report back what's happening. And it's interesting that they're not talking with each other. They're talking to me, but they're not talking with each other, and they're sort of all waiting on this kind of discernment process. So it's there a bit, not as formal right now as I'd like it.
What about yourself, Dan?
Well, I do have a spiritual director. It's Father Sanderson, who was here in the wheelchair for the earlier talk and for Mass. And actually, before he left, I made my confession. He's also a clinical psychologist, so it's harder to deceive him. He, as you can see from his appearance, he has advanced Parkinson's now. His mind remains as clear as crystal. And I found through the years of having somebody generally I didn't work with, and somebody I didn't have other connections with, made it better. Not somebody I was with all the time. It was a focus thing.
Yeah. Can I add one word, because I know time is... We've been talking about me and my spirituality, but we must remember, actually, our spirituality is formed within the womb of the church.
Yeah.
We need one another. And the most important thing to encourage all our people and ourselves to do is to be there when we meet for worship on the Sunday, encourage people to gather together, because that's the major point of our prayer life. And our individual life really trickles out, I hope we agree, from that very center, the Eucharistic community.
Yeah. Well, you know, as a musician, I've always felt that there's a parallel. Particularly, the kind of music I play more than anything is jazz, which involves getting together with people and improvising.
Yeah.
And there's something magical which happens when you get together and you play.
Yeah.
But if you don't practice, if you don't spend time on your own practicing and developing your own musical language and your discipline and so forth, the time spent with others is time wasted, and you just fumble. And it seems to me there's the same sort of oscillation between liturgical prayer and private prayer, and you need them. They both reinforce each other, don't they? I read a book years ago on I don't know, Anglican spirituality or something. I don't even remember who wrote it, but the whole point is, and this is hardly unique to Anglicanism, but the idea that our spirituality is always connected in some way to our liturgical life. Yeah. And there's always a cross-fertilization, which is, I think, embodied in our tradition with the value, the way in which the prayer book has an important role at home and on our bedside table, as well as in the church pew, that we use the prayer book and the prayers of the church as part of our individual prayer life too. And I know this happens. Similar things happen in Orthodoxy and so forth. Well, I think thank you very much. It's really, I find extremely encouraging to hear folks like you share your own very personal thoughts about this, and it encourages me to engage in my own practice of prayer with new joy and enthusiasm. Undoubtedly, you all feel the same way.